or I might be teaching in an empty room. I'm trying to figure out what I want to do, but I think I'm going to go asynchronous as I specified in the syllabus. So I'm going to film from my house, and you might get a Smedley sighting if you're lucky. All right, so our review session. Our review session is going to be on Monday, October 19th at 8. No, I take that back. At 7. At 7. I like 7. All right. So review session is at 7 p.m. I will be sending you a Zoom link later this afternoon, and I will be recording it. So if you can't make it, that is okay. I will send you a link to the recording on Tuesday. Now, normally I would do this on Tuesday, but I'm going to say it. Dr. Gilchrist does have hobbies, and I'm not just a workaholic, even though I love my work. And I do trivia on Tuesday nights, and I had to skip last week. I'm not skipping this week. So you get a review session on Monday, if that is okay. And if you can't watch it, then it'll be recorded for you. The exam will be due on Wednesday night, 11:59 p.m. Central Time. If you encounter any questions, or if you have any questions, hit me up on the Discord. Shoot me an email when you can. All right, so also, as I mentioned in an email that I sent to you earlier today, we do have quiz 6 is going to post on Sunday the 18th. It will be due on Sunday the 25th. So make sure you get those in. All right. Hey, come on, you. Okay, so the last time that we were here, we were talking about different ways to test episodic memory. And I talked a little bit about the difference between a recall test and a recognition test. So with a recall test, you are basically having to consciously retrieve all of the items yourself. With recognition, I am basically giving you an item and saying, hey, did you see this before? Yes or no. So recognition tends to be a more sensitive test of memory. So if you don't have enough ability to recall it, you might have enough ability to recognize it. And one of the things that we find is that older adults in particular, memory tends to get worse as you age. For older adults, recall does get harder, but you don't really see a lot of age differences on recognition tests because you can either use your actual conscious recollection of the item, or you can use a feeling of familiarity to help you find it. So as I kind of mentioned with recognition, there are 2 different ways that we can recognize these. And a lot of this comes from work by Larry Jacoby. And so if you're watching this in the YouTube video, you can actually see my head write this down. So Larry Jacoby is the person who's done a lot of work on recognition. And one of the things that he mentions is that we have 2 different ways that we can recognize something. So if I show you a multiple choice question on a test, which is a recognition test, you can use one of 2 ways to basically recognize that item. You can either do what is called recollection, which is when you consciously go back in your mind and you actively try to search for that item in your memory, similar to what you would do for recall. So recollection is a little bit harder, but we can also use a sense of familiarity to help us identify something in a recognition test. This is fast. It's very automatic. So recollection is a little bit slower. It's a little more controlled. It's a little more conscious. So once again, we're kind of seeing that divergence between, bless you, between these fast automatic processes and these more controlled, effortful, conscious processes. Recollection is a slower, conscious, effortful process. Familiarity is not. It tends to be fast and automatic, and it's also based on memory strength. Now, I mentioned that compared to young adults, older adults don't really have problems with recognition, But when you actually look at their recognition, one of the things that we do find is that as you age, conscious recollection becomes a little bit harder, and you're going to be more likely to rely on a sense of familiarity as you age. Now, that leads you to not really having any problems with recognition, but what is driving that recognition does shift with age. You basically shift from more recollection to more familiarity. Do you need me to go back? Anybody? Okay, cool. So one of the things that I think does bear a little bit of repeating, which we will talk about more when we get into everyday memory next week. Memories are not these static images. They are not like photographs. They are not like videos. They are prone to different types of distortions and errors. So one of the things that I often like to do, and if you were in my general psychology class, you might remember me doing this. I gave you words like pillow, downy, fluffy, kitten, and things like that. Now, occasionally, and I believe that's not actually the list I gave you. This is a similar sort of list. I think I gave you a list with words like sugar, heart, tooth, tart, cake, pie, chocolate, honey, soda, those words. So oftentimes what we will find is that people will falsely recall the word sweet, even though the word sweet was never shown. Likewise, if I give you a list of words like fluffy, downy, pillow, kitten, hard, you'll eventually think of the word soft. So one of the things that we find is that memories are active reconstructions. Every time that we retrieve a memory, we are actually in the process of rebuilding it. So that kind of goes back to Moscovich's idea of multiple trace theory. The idea that every time that we recall an episodic memory, we're also in the process of re-encoding it. And here's the thing about encoding. Encoding is a really fragile process. Anytime that you are encoding something, it is vulnerable to adding new information that could potentially distort it. So one of the things that we'll kind of talk about more next week when we talk about everyday memory is that anytime that you have a goal of entertaining people versus accuracy. So we can talk about memory for entertainment purposes, or we can talk about memory for accuracy. So memory for accuracy might be the kind of studying that you do for my tests. Memory for entertainment is when you share memories with people that have an entertaining component. You're telling stories. When you have a goal to entertain, you add embellishments, you add details, you add exaggerations to make the story more entertaining. And every time you tell that story, the more it becomes distorted. And because you're re-encoding it every time, you're basically taking all of those details that you added into the story and you basically made them a part of the story. And the next time that you remember that, you'll think that they're real. Now, here's one other way that we can kind of see that our memories are like active reconstructions. So here's what I'd like you to do. I want you to think about a memory that's happened to you pretty recently. Every single one of you, whether you're on Zoom or in class, I want you to think of something very recently in your mind that has happened to you. So here's my question. I want you to think about that memory. Now, as you're seeing that memory, here's my question. Are you viewing this from a first person perspective, like you're actually viewing it out of your own eyes? Or are you viewing yourself in a third person perspective? So there's another you outside of yourself doing this. So if you're here in class, raise your hand with either a 1 finger or 3 fingers if it's first or third person. Okay, 1, 3. That's 1. Okay, so we've got a mix of first and third person. How's it looking on Zoom? Do y'all use a first person perspective or a third person perspective? Let's go ahead and look in the chat. Anybody? Eh? I'll give you a few minutes. Okay, all right, that's fine. So one of the things that we find, how often do you actually see yourself in a third person perspective? Unless you are walking with a hand mirror by you all the time, you're always viewing your life from a first person perspective. So if you viewed yourself from a third person perspective, guess what? You've already distorted the memory. You have already distorted it. You've already reconstructed it. It's not like a photograph. You've changed it. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's completely inaccurate. Like, this is not me telling you you can't trust what you remember. I think you can. I think you can get the overall meaning. I would be very careful about the smaller details, though. Those are going to be prone to distortion. And oftentimes, this is really going to come into play when we talk about eyewitness testimony. Eyewitness testimony and eyewitness memory are often used as these infallible sources of information. And I hate to break it to you, they ain't. If you talk to any memory expert, they will tell you that they shouldn't be. And yet judges, lawyers, and juries all think, hey, memory is infallible. You can't mess that up. Okay. So why are we prone to distorting our episodic memory? So there are a couple of different explanations for why this happens. So first of all, think about what it would take for you to have a permanent, perfect record with every detail in place. That's a lot of information. And frankly, let's be honest. Do you need a picture perfect record of what you ate for breakfast this morning? I don't. You probably don't either. That is a very trivial thing. And I think that most of us recognize that, save for some very big life events, most of the things that we do each day in a perfect world are trivial. It's too much for your brain to handle to have a permanent record of every possible event that you've ever encountered. Additionally, and we've kind of seen this with change blindness, where you don't necessarily have to pay attention to all of the details of the scene. You need to know what the big picture idea is. So I don't necessarily need to remember all of the fine details of the objects that were on my countertop to know I had a pumpkin spice bagel for breakfast. It was a great bagel too. And I've still got 2 more and I'm going to eat them really fast because, well, I like pumpkin spice. Yes, I am that basic and I am not ashamed. So in general, most of the time, what we're looking for to navigate our lives are the overall meaning of the experience. We don't need the fine details. We just need the gist. And that's also true when we're trying to remember other things as well. So if there's a fight that you had with a friend, unless they said something that was really offensive and hurtful to you, you're probably not going to remember the exact phrasing of how that fight went. But you have the overall idea of what the fight was about, and the meaning is more important than those finer details or the grammar that was used. Additionally, this is kind of a byproduct of our ability to have a very, very rich fantasy life. This is especially true for kids. So one of the things that we find with kids, you can ask them to imagine something. So I think this was a study by Ceci and colleagues. Zoom keeps closing and the connection is really bad. Let me write this down. I'm doing YouTube live for this, so if Dr. Gilchrist has all of the angles covered. Robbie's Wi-Fi is trash. Are we in agreement? I don't know. I'm not in Robbie. There are certain parts of my house's Wi-Fi that are also trash, so I understand. I'm sorry, Maya. I'm really sorry. So we'll be on, I will put this on later for you. Hopefully you'll be able to see it. So one of the things they found, this was a study by Ceci and colleagues. They basically had children imagine their finger getting caught in a mousetrap. So I want to be really clear that this event never actually happened. No kid got their finger caught in a mousetrap. They were simply told to imagine it. So you were basically told to come up with a story. So the kids would be like, well, I got my finger caught in a mousetrap and my little brother wouldn't stop crying. And then my dad put me in an ambulance. And then we went to the hospital. And then the doctor joked that my finger would have to come off. So the kids come up with a story. All they have to do is imagine it. And here's the thing about kids, especially when they're little, do they know the difference between reality and fantasy? Not really. Like, my little cousins thought that kicking like the Power Rangers wouldn't hurt anybody, and they were very, very wrong. So here's what's interesting. So Ceci basically brought the kids back in weeks later and asked them, do you remember this happening? And the kids were just insistent that this event that they had to imagine actually really happened. And when the researchers tried to tell the kids, hey, you were here, you made this up here, the kids would basically say, well, why do I remember it if it didn't happen? So imagination can absolutely lead us to distorting our memories because of that. And not just for kids. So now we're going to move on to talking about forgetting and amnesia. Hooray, hooray. So guess what? Dr. Gilchrist has another demonstration for you. Yay! I love demonstrations in cognitive psychology. With few exceptions, I can socially distance, and they're cheap. I like cheap. Okay. Oh, I had it. Where was it? I thought I put it in here. Oh, wait. Oh, let me see. Huh. I thought I had it on here. I'm gonna pause this for a second, and I'm gonna go get that because that is not, oh, there it is. That's why. That was the wrong set of slides. Here we go. I had the old version and the version I updated. I'm like, oh, wait. Okay, so I'm going to read these to you. I want you to try to remember them. Yay. Okay, so here are a list of words for you to remember. Ulcer, market, oven, jury, apple, glass, window, lamp, elbow, drum, barn, pull. Are we feeling pretty good? Well, guess what? That list was for practice and you're not going to be tested on it. Yeah, I suck. All right, here's another list of words. Belt, yarn, king, army, nose, fence, mule, duck. I'm not a student, I can say it. Quart, infant, water, and pipe. Now recall as many items as you can from that list. All right, everybody good? Anybody need some more time? All right. Good? Yeah, guess what? Now recall as many items as you can from the practice list. After I told you you weren't going to be tested on it. I know, I'm so mean. Dr. Gilchrist is the meanest. She tricks you with psychology experiments. All right, are we good? Okay, so take a look at how many items you recalled from the first list you had to recall. How many did you get? Go ahead and count them up. 3. This isn't the practice list. This is the second list. So the first list, the second list. How many did you get? Okay, pretty good. How many did you get for the other, the practice list? Less? Oh, that's not bad. That's not bad. Okay, so here's the thing. So what we tend to find, and obviously this is a demonstration, it's a really small sample. I'm not controlling for a lot of things, but you know what happens when you tell somebody that a list is for practice? They tend to forget about it. Or if you tell them that an item is for practice and they won't need to remember it for later, they tend to forget it. So what we actually did was something that is called the directed forgetting procedure. And we call it the directed forgetting procedure because it works. If I tell you you aren't going to be tested on something, you tend to forget about it. It's why you will very rarely hear me say, I'm not going to test you on this, because I know if I say that, y'all won't remember it. So here's another cute little personal story. So when I was first working in a cognitive psychology lab as an undergrad, in addition to doing the false memory paradigm that I've shown many of you, I also did a lot of directed forgetting. And students would get very annoyed when I was like, hey, you remember that list I told you you don't have to remember? Surprise, you actually do. Yeah, students don't like feeling like they've been tricked. So let's go ahead and start talking about some of those different theories of forgetting. So you might remember me talking a couple of days ago about the work of Hermann Ebbinghaus. So just as a reminder, Ebbinghaus basically learned lists of nonsense syllables that were made up of a consonant, a vowel, and another consonant. So basically like these. So I'm going to pause on the share for just a minute. So they'd get words like, they'd get these nonsense syllables like TOJ or WER. And so those were the kind of nonsense syllables that he was actually working to learn. And in this particular experiment, so in the first experiment that he did, we found that the more that you repeat a list, the better your memory for that list is. That's the total time hypothesis. The more that you study, the better your memory is. The other thing that he did is he actually is one of the first people to look at a forgetting curve. So in this particular case, he would take a list of words and he would learn it until it was absolutely perfect. So he'd learn it until it was learned absolutely perfectly. And then, depending on the situation, he would wait a certain amount of time before he would try to recall it again. So in some cases, he recalled the list immediately, which you can see here on the x-axis. He'd wait an hour. He'd wait 8 hours. He'd wait 24 hours or a whole day, 48 hours or 2 days, 120 hours or 5 days, or 744 hours, which is approximately about a month. And here's what Ebbinghaus found. So he basically did something called a savings method. So he would see how long it took him to relearn the list. So if you were at 100%, it took no time to relearn that list. So you're basically retesting the same material after relearning, and you're trying to see how many fewer trials you need to reach that criterion of remembering 100% of the list. So if you're at 100% savings, it took no time to relearn it. If you watch the savings drop, that means it takes more time to relearn it because there's more forgetting. So this is the famous Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. And we find that this holds up over a wide variety of studies. And basically what we find is that forgetting over time is a logarithmic function with a majority of memories being lost within the first hour of studying. So what happens is that forgetting is initially very rapid. Look at how much it drops from 0 hours. So that's basically immediate recall compared to the first hour. That is like over a 50% drop. And then what you'll kind of notice is that over past that hour, there's still decline, there's still forgetting, but it levels off. It's much more stable. All right, everybody good? Okay. So here are some other things that we know about forgetting over time. So research from Rubin and Wenzel back in 1996. Interestingly enough, autobiographical memory, which we will talk more about next week, memories that are really important to our life narrative, like our personal narrative. And we're not just talking about what you had for breakfast. We're talking like big life events that are important for your life story. Rubin and Wenzel basically found that those memories tend to show slower forgetting than more trivial episodic memories. So you'll probably be more likely to remember your high school graduation much more easily than just one random trivial day from high school. Additionally, one of the other things that we know is that older memories tend to be more resistant to forgetting than newer ones of similar strength. This is what's known as Jost's law. So one of the ways that you kind of see this, you can kind of see Jost's law in action, is if you're looking at people who have Alzheimer's disease. So after the initial atrophy of the hippocampus, which damages somebody's ability to convert short-term memory into new long-term memories, atrophy then spreads to the cerebral cortex where already stored long-term memories tend to reside. So this is an overall cortical atrophy. And one of the things that we know is that partially based on Jost's law, because older memories tend to be more resilient, and what we find is that most memories, when people lose memories with Alzheimer's disease, it tends to be last in, first out. That means newer memories are going to be more likely to be forgotten relatively early on, and older memories will be lost later on in time as the disease progresses. And that's because older memories tend to be stronger, and they also decay more slowly. And then finally, one of the other things that we find is that forgetting is much slower for implicit than for explicit memory. How many of you in here have not ridden a bike in a very long time? Okay, but odds are pretty good if I went and put you on a bike, you'd be able to ride it without too much trouble. That is an implicit memory, and it's less likely to be forgotten than something that is explicit. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the role that interference plays. So your book talks about this a little bit more than I will. There's a big debate with respect to forgetting. There have been a lot of people that say that forgetting is solely a function of time. And there were other researchers, especially in the 40s, that said, no, forgetting is not a function of time. Forgetting is a function of introducing other information that can compete with it. So this is what's known as interference. And we're going to talk a little bit about the role that interference plays with forgetting. So how are memories forgotten? Now, I'm not going to deny there is very much an effect of time that is in play here. But a lot of people these days tend to believe that memories aren't really gone, but rather that they can become harder to recall because of interference. So interference is basically when retrieval is disrupted by either previous or future learning. So perhaps learning new information hurts your ability to learn old information, or in other cases, old information hurts your ability to remember new information. So we're going to talk about two different types in particular. So the first type is what is called proactive interference. This is when old information interferes with your ability to remember new information. So an example that happens to me quite a bit is occasionally, and odds are pretty good this happens to you too, occasionally without asking for it, you get a new credit card or a new debit card because of a security breach. And then you have to learn a brand new PIN. And so I've had instances where I've gone into a store and I've got my new card, and what do? I enter in my old PIN. That is a case of proactive interference. My old information has hurt my ability to learn the new information. Can anybody think of another example of proactive interference in your life? So how about this? How many of you, up until very recently, for those of you that drive, how many of you have like a favorite parking spot in the parking lot? Okay, I get it, we're creatures of habit. Now, how many of you have had this happen where one day your favorite parking spot is not there and you have to find a new spot? Now, here's my question. So when you go to your car, do you originally go to your old spot and then you're like, oh yeah, I didn't park here today? That's proactive interference. So one of my favorite examples, and I'll share this with you because, well, if there's anything that you know about me, I'm not afraid to share embarrassing stories about myself, and they're not that embarrassing. If they're really embarrassing, I'd never share them with you. Occasionally, I've wanted to park, and before I got my current house, where I live 5 minutes away and pretty much walk all the time, occasionally I would drive to work. And especially when I lived on the other side of town before I bought my house, I drove every day. And there were some days, depending on what time you came in, the parking lot was totally full. And I didn't want to park on the street, so I'd go park at Hink House. And I'm not going to lie to you, there was definitely one day where I had to do that. And I walked out to the RBAC parking lot and I started freaking out because my car wasn't there. I'm like, oh my gosh, my car's stolen. And it took me like 2 seconds. I'm like, oh yeah, I parked it over in Hink House. My car is fine. Thank goodness I didn't flip out in front of a bunch of people. So that's another case of proactive interference. Does anybody know of any others? Okay. All right, so another type of interference that we can have is retroactive interference. So if you're having trouble remembering these two types of interference, remember that proactive means forward acting, retroactive means backward acting. So retroactive interference is when new information hurts our ability to remember old information. Does anybody have any examples of retroactive interference? So you learned something new, and because you learned something new, you forgot how to do something older. Yeah, Ash.
So for my job, we have to put in like a 4-digit code to enter like the database that has all the food and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I'll put in my card pin because I recently got a debit card. So I'll just put the newer password I remember versus the old one that I've known for like a year.
Okay. So they mentioned putting in a new password that they knew instead of an older one that they had had before to access food for their job. So that's one possibility. I know for me, one thing that has occasionally happened is when I get a new phone number, I have trouble remembering my old phone numbers that I used to have. Though to be fair, now with cell phones, you can basically have the same phone number the rest of your life, which I do. Another example that I found is changing license plates. So when I get a new license plate number, I immediately forget the old one. Is anybody here wanting to do study abroad at some point? So here's a fun one that I have occasionally heard of that we're actually going to talk about today. There are cases where people go to study abroad or they stay in a different country for a few years and they start to pick up the native language in the area. And it actually hurts their ability to speak their native language a little bit. So my friend's brother went and stayed in Germany for a couple of years. So he got really, really good at speaking German. But when he came back to the States, all of that new learning that he had done temporarily hurt his ability to speak English well. And that can absolutely happen if you are studying abroad, especially when you're having to learn a new language. So in your book, they talk a little bit about different tests of proactive and retroactive interference. So the idea here for a proactive interference test, you basically learn cat tree, you learn cat dirt, and then you're tested on cat dirt. So the idea is if you ended up recalling tree, that would actually be a case of proactive interference because old information was interfering with new information. On the other hand, with retroactive interference, the idea is you get cat dirt, you learn cat dirt, and you get tested on cat dirt. If you remember cat tree from a previous trial, that would be a case of, or in a future trial, that would be a case of retroactive interference. So here's something actually kind of interesting. And I kind of mentioned this in the video that I filmed where I talked about part set queuing interference. Interference is not a passive process. It turns out that it can be affected by working memory capacity. So this comes from research by Mike Kane and Randy Engel. And they basically presented people with a test of proactive interference. And then depending on the condition, they either had no cognitive load or they had a different attentional load. So while they were doing this proactive interference task, they had another task that was demanding their attention as well. So they were having to do a concurrent task. So they either had to do just the memory task or the memory task plus an attentionally demanding task. And then we break up this data by looking at people with either high or low attentional capacity. Because this is Randy Engel's research, that's probably based on O-span, operation span performance, because that's his span task. So here's what we find. When you have high working memory capacity or high attentional capacity, when there's no concurrent task, high spans are really, really good at reducing that proactive interference effect. Compare that to people with low working memory spans, and they're showing a lot of proactive interference. I wish there were some error bars here so I could say if this is significant or not. But once you introduce an additional task where they have to focus their attention, all of a sudden, the people with the high working memory spans are actually showing more interference than our low working memory span people. So attention also plays a role. If you're really good at controlling your attention, you will be less likely to fall for interference unless you are doing something that is cognitively demanding at the same time. So I kind of mentioned this already, but retroactive interference proactive interference is really, really easy to demonstrate in everyday life. Retroactive interference is a little bit harder, but we do actually find that bilingual learning can actually lead to retroactive interference. When you learn a second language, it actually hurts your ability to remember your native language. And Misha DeWar and colleagues actually found that part of the reason that this happens is because, first of all, you're expending a lot of mental effort on learning this second language that you don't really have to do with the first. Like, think about how little you think about what you want to say. Or think about how little you think about language, your native language. And this leads to some really interesting mistakes. So yesterday I went to go grab something in the oven and I called it an onion because oven and onion sound a lot alike, but that's how little we think about our native language. The other thing too is that often this effect is especially going to be pronounced when you're learning similar materials. So for example, my friend's brother who lost his ability to speak English proficiently because he learned German, odds are pretty good that would be less likely to happen with a language that was less similar, like French. One of the things that we know is that German and English are very, very similar languages. Odds are pretty good you'd find a very similar sort of effect if you were learning both French and Spanish. Those both have Latin roots. So the more similar that languages are, the more pronounced this effect is going to become. You're going to be a lot less likely to see retroactive interference if you're studying for tests, if one test is for math and the other test is for English. But if you're learning 2 foreign languages at the same time, this is going to be a lot more likely. So here are some, oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Get too excited, going too fast. You good? Okay. So some of the issues with interference theory, this is by and large concerned with explicit memory. And we know that interference can happen with implicit memory as well. I have occasionally played similar musical instruments and those interfere with each other, but that is by and large an implicit task. And not everybody really talks about that. And here's the other thing. So when we talk about decay, we're talking about time-based forgetting. Interference theory basically says the only reason that we forget anything is because other information is competing for our retrieval. But here's the thing, decay does happen. You can have time-based loss. These things do happen. So this is my personal postulate. It's not always right, but when you typically have 2 competing theories, such as interference and decay, They're usually both a little bit right. There's not just one and the other. It's probably a pretty good mix of both of those factors. Good? All right. So now we're going to talk, and we'll talk about this more starting on Monday. We will talk a little bit about motivated forgetting. I'll try not to get too irate with certain topics because a couple of these hit really close to home. And I'll tell you why next time. So I know. I put Sigmund Freud in my cognitive psychology class. I know, I'm just as annoyed as you are. So here's the thing. Cognitive scientists don't really like to talk about Sigmund Freud, but I will give the man credit. He talks a lot about how information often tends to be processed at a level below our conscious awareness. And in that respect, he is not wrong. He's wrong on a lot of other things, though. My drugs and behavior students got to hear me talk about how he believed that use of cocaine could help with alcohol and opioid addiction. He really was very interested in figuring out the physical properties of cocaine. But he doesn't really talk that much about memory except in one aspect. And since we are talking about memory, we have to address this. Freud was a big believer in repression, that there's this idea that there are often motivated forgetting of either traumatic or threatening events, and this can be conscious or unconscious. Here's the thing about repression. It's very, very circular in its logic. So the idea is, if you wanted to give somebody like Freud evidence against repression, you'd basically go, well, I don't have any traumatic events that have happened in my life. And Freud would go, well, that's just because you've repressed them. That's very circular logic. It's a bad argument, and you can't really scientifically test Freud's idea. Now, having said that, motivated forgetting does happen. When I was in 6th grade, and let's be clear, middle school is hell. I was very, very badly bullied in 6th grade. I had an aunt very suddenly and unexpectedly die at the age of 37. And I just had a really bad year. And there's a lot of that I don't really remember very well. And that is probably because it hurts too much. And I probably actively blocked that out. So sometimes we do this consciously. Sometimes we do this unconsciously, but we still talk a lot about repression, especially in the 80s and 90s. We're going to look at survivors of different types of abuse. And we're going to talk about recovered memories next time. And we will talk about what is called the memory war of the 90s. So we're going to talk about recovered memories and whether or not they're real. All right, so everybody have a great weekend. Don't forget to take your quiz, and I will see you here on Monday. Have a good weekend, make good choices, don't lick doorknobs, and